Millions of people all over the world are affected by conflict and fragility, and the impact goes beyond affecting a single life, a single community, or even a single country. Conflict is one of the greatest development challenges of our time. The New Deal is an agreement that sets out new ways for donors to engage with fragile states. It's country-led and country-owned.
The New Deal is a way of helping fragile as well as developing countries to be able to take charge of their destiny.
The New Deal is all about putting everyone together and going in the same direction long term.
Lessons from around the world on what does and does not work are reflected in the New Deal. Countries and global partners must invest in what will make sustainable peace possible. These are the 5 peace-building and state-building goals.
The first one is inclusive politics, and we should make sure that it's inclusive to make the situation as resilient as possible. If you're not secure, then it's very difficult to have sustainable development, and people must feel safe. Access to justice and really building the legal system is very important. Economic growth. This is of course also very basic for any country that needs to get out of fragility and poverty. And the 5th one is institutions and service delivery. So you need to make sure that the service delivery reaches out to the people.
So the PSGs are the very foundations of ensuring that countries move from fragility to levels of resilience.
There are 2 guiding principles: a real commitment to country-led and country-owned processes, and to building strong partnerships with stakeholders to ensure results. Prior to joining the New Deal, Sierra Leone had already overcome high levels of violence and held peaceful and democratic elections, including the transition of power to an opposition leader in 2007. The New Deal strengthened national ownership of the development agenda. 2014 is the year that millions of Afghans cast their ballot in a peaceful presidential election, and the year that the international military force is scheduled to leave the country. Afghanistan has made great strides in working with donors to ensure that aid and national development policies are focused on delivering results for the people.
I think Somalia is the best example of great progress, and it's been a completely collapsed state since 1991, and this has been an instrument to really strengthen Somalia, and we're hoping to see a peaceful Somalia where the New Deal principles are applied, where there's working groups around all these peace-building and state-building goals. We should never think that this is a quick fix, because if peace was a quick fix, then we would have fixed it.
So it is when a country takes charge of its development destiny, will you then say that development indeed is underway?
I think the New Deal is perfectly designed for helping out to achieve the goal number 16 that we just adopted here at the United Nations on peaceful societies.
Addressing conflict and violence must be a priority post-2015.
And the New Deal, as you know, calls for stronger ownership. And that's very, very much a common tune throughout all of our countries, individually and collectively.
More countries and organizations that join the New Deal, the more powerful our impact will be.
I am optimistic that indeed humanity has committed itself to ensuring that we do that which is right for humanity.
It is time now for us to take the next steps, to do more, to be bold, and to work together.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for being here. My name's Catherine Nwajaku-Dahu, and I am the head of the International Dialogue Secretariat. I'm not going to need to explain very much about the New Deal, which is what we're here to talk about, because I think that film has done it all for me. So, without further ado, I will introduce you to our panelists. There are many of us, and we've all got quite a lot to say, I imagine. So, without further ado, let me introduce. First of all, we have Mr. Oscar Fernandez Taranco. We have Helder da Costa, Hodan Osman, Annelies Clausen, Chukwuemeka Chikezie, Paul Okumo, Dan Smith, and Sarah Cliff. I'll say a few words about them all, our distinguished panelists. So first, Mr. Oscar Fernandez Taranco. Many of you may know him already. He is the Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding in the Peacebuilding Support Office. He was appointed to this post in September 2014 with over 30 years' experience in the UN system. He is Argentinian by nationality, and we're very pleased to have him with us. I'll move on to Mr. Helder da Costa, Dr. Helder da Costa, the General Secretary of the G7+. Mr. da Costa he's the General Secretary of the G7+. He has a PhD in trade policy from the University of Adelaide, and he has been working very closely with international dialogue right from the very beginning. On top of his role in the G7+, he continues to provide advice to the Minister of Finance on aid effectiveness and New Deal implementation. He is from Timor-Leste. And then we have Hodan Osman, who is Senior Advisor and Head of Strategy, the Strategy Unit in the Ministry of Finance, the Federal Government of Somalia. She is part of the senior management team, leading on policy development and reform and strengthening public financial management systems. Hodan, prior to working with government, had come with 10 years' experience in the financial sector in Canada and the United States. She holds a bachelor's degree in business administration from York University and a master's in human rights and international relations from University of Glasgow, my birthplace. I'm very happy to hear that. And we have Annelies Clausen, who many of you, of course, will know, who is from the bank here, Senior Operations Officer, responsible for partnerships in the World Bank Fragility, Conflict and Violence Group. And I believe she's added a new string to her bow in being responsible for humanitarian affairs. Is that correct?
Development Nexus.
Oh, Nexus, yes, Development Nexus. Okay, and what else? Annelies has been working very closely with the dialogue for a very long time. She is also the chair of INCAF. INCAF is the Network on Conflict and Fragility of the OECD DAC, and she chairs the task team on implementation and reform. She's an economic historian and political scientist and brings a wealth of experience to this panel. Then we have Mr. Chukwuemeka Chikezie from Sierra Leone. He is director of Up Africa Limited. He founded an organization called AFORD, the African Foundation for Development, in '94, and has been working on private sector and diaspora issues for a long time. He has worked very closely with the dialogue in the recent past, starting to build work on the private sector that's increasingly important work stream. So we're very pleased to have him on this panel also. And then I move to Paul Okumo. Paul heads the Africa platform. The platform is part of the civil society platform on peace building and state building. He has had a very close association also with the international dialogue since its inception. He was the first and only civil society panelist during the launch of the New Deal in Busan in 2011. He also sits on the UNDP Africa Programme Advisory Board and has a number of other strings to his bow. Then we have Director of experie, Dan Smith. As many of you will know, Dan Smith comes with a long career in this field. He's been head of experie since 2015 September. He has a number of publications, a long record on publishing on peace building and gender and armed conflicts and related issues. He served for 4 years as UN Peacebuilding Fund on the advisory group, 2 of those years which he was chair. He has also been a professor of peace and conflicts at the University of Manchester. He has a long list of other strings to his bow, and I'm not going to go into that detail. And okay, finally, we have Sarah Cliff. She's back on her old home turf. Many of you will know her already from her long career in the bank. She is director of CIC. As you know, CIC was responsible for developing the report, the independent review of the New Deal and international dialogue. Sarah is, what else can I say about her? She was special representative for the bank's World Development Report, very influential publication in 2011, which many of you will know. And she has a bachelor's degree in history from Cambridge University, a master's in international relations, and an international economic policy from Columbia. So, a hefty panel. Right, I will, with no further ado, I will call on Sarah, please Sarah, to open this panel by presenting highlights from the said review. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this working? Good. I am in some danger of losing my voice, so bear with me as I go through this. Do we have... we have an absolutely impenetrable slide, I see. Don't worry, I will talk us through it. First, just to say it's a pleasure to be here and also to be here with so many old friends in the audience and on the panel. I was thinking in preparing for this event that we should really reflect for a moment on how far we have come in the debate on fragility and peace building and state building. 10 years ago, I was still at the World Bank. I was just finishing my time as head of the conflict-affected countries department here. And at that point, some of the developments we have today, I think, were very difficult to imagine. The G7 Plus didn't yet exist, so a strong voice for countries that were conflict-affected didn't exist internationally. The Fragility Forum, this event that we're all at today, didn't exist, and I would have found it hard to imagine an event attracting so many people from around the world on this topic. And of course, the SDGs didn't exist. And Goal 16, as we saw from the video, with its very strong focus on peace, access to justice, and institution building, wasn't in place. I can remember many, many conversations bemoaning the fact that the MDGs didn't include a goal on conflict, and we should really now take a moment to think that we've progressed a great deal beyond that. But we're not yet in a place that we can celebrate. At the most fundamental level, the outcome level, unfortunately, conflict worldwide has actually ticked up in the last 4 years. So we would like to be in a position to say that conflict is really decreasing. Goodbye conflict, hello development, as the G7 Plus slogan always used to say. But unfortunately, worldwide, this is not what we've seen in the last period. That, I think, is the background to the evaluation of the New Deal, which my institute has just completed. And I will just go through some highlights of that evaluation. I'll talk first about 3 areas of strengths and weaknesses. The New Deal as a coalition for change, national ownership and country-level implementation, and aid patterns and investment. And then I'll talk about some parameters for a New Deal for the New Deal, which the evaluation recommends. First, on strengths and weaknesses of the New Deal in implementation. The New Deal as a coalition for change, I think, has been an outstanding success. So the Sustainable Development Goals adopted last September really reflect the amount that the normative and policy dialogue has moved to put peace, access to justice, institution building, legitimate politics, right in the middle of the development agenda. That happens through SDG 16, the goal on peace and access to justice, but it's important to realize it's also, in a much deeper way, right across the Sustainable Development Goal agenda. It's in the commitment to leave no one behind, including those affected by conflict and fragility, who are most likely to be left behind development progress. It's in the very strong emphasis on differentiated country approaches, including approaches that are really geared to countries which are affected by conflict. And it's in the language on the preamble on peace and development, which goes beyond recognizing the linkage to recognize that peace, access to justice, and other aspects of the peace building and state building goals are really part of development welfare. They're part of development progress. Second, on national ownership and implementation, here I think the progress that the evaluation shows is more mixed. There has been some very strong progress in some countries, and countries have also used the New Deal in ways that are appropriate to their own circumstances, which I think is a very positive thing. For instance, it does inform national plans in Liberia, Somalia, Timor-Leste, assessment and monitoring mechanisms in countries such as DRC. It's been used to empower government and increase aid effectiveness in the dialogue with donors in countries such as Afghanistan, Sierra Leone, and again, Timor-Leste. But few of the New Deal countries have had the whole of government and whole of international partner approach, which the New Deal really requires. So one of the things which the evaluation looks at is how the success in countries such as Timor-Leste, such as Somalia, where you've had very strong central government ownership of the New Deal principles, has outpaced sometimes what has happened in other countries, where the New Deal has been strongly owned by ministries of finance and plan, but not necessarily owned across a broader span of political leadership. So this is one takeaway message from the evaluation. Third, on aid patterns. And here we have to say that overall the picture has been more negative. So the New Deal was intending to both increase aid to fragile states, to increase alignment with the peace building and state building goals, and to decrease the volatility of aid. And only really on the first objective so far have we succeeded. So aid in aggregate has increased to fragile states. But the volatility and the disparities between countries have not really changed. And this is something that for a long time we've pointed out as undermining progress. And the alignment with the peace building and state building goals has not greatly changed. So for example, for the G7 plus countries, in 2011, 3.6% of their aid went to legitimate politics, 5.5% to security, and 4.7% to justice. By 2014, by last year, that was 2.8%, 6.4%, and 1%. Meaning that for aid to support legitimate politics and to support access to justice, it actually went down over that period. There's a similar picture if you take a larger group of countries than only the G7 plus membership. So there have been some successes on the investment pattern, but there are also some areas of backtracking where it's important to keep an eye on them in future. The last point that I would say on aid is that this is particularly important to look at the moment because of the consequences of the Mediterranean refugee crises and the demands for aid for humanitarian purposes to countries that are strongly affected by refugees. That is, of course, crucially important to provide for the welfare of those people, but there is a danger that part of that reallocation draws attention away from some of the long-term fragile situations which really need investment and which need staying the course on the donor side. So going to what the evaluation finds on the New Deal for the New Deal, I'll just make 4 very quick points. It recommends that all the stakeholders to the New Deal, the G7 plus and the INCAF donors, think very hard about building on normative success by strengthening the political relevance of the New Deal. The international dialogue could look at repositioning itself as a multi-stakeholder platform under SDG 17, the goal which looks at means of implementation of the SDGs. The G7 Plus could look at building on the very stalwart work that they have already done to reach out to middle-income countries who were not at the beginning involved in the New Deal, and try to really make sure that their ownership and support is there. And then that could be brought back together to have a broader and more inclusive platform. In doing that, it would also be important to take into account the need for better partnerships with civil society and the private sector. Private sector investment in fragile situations is still very low, roughly 6% of total FDI, so that's an opportunity. Second, to strengthen operational relevance. And here our team recommended moving very much from the what of the peace building and state building goals to the how of implementation. How do you mobilize the kind of political momentum for change, which we know is always very difficult in fragile situations? And how do you sequence the policy, capacity building, delivery decisions to create success? There is an opportunity also for the G7 Plus to look at a new national dialogue now that we have the SDGs on place to really broaden the ownership and create a strong momentum again around those goals. And I know that they are already working on this. I'm sure that we'll hear comments about it later on. There's an opportunity to solve some of the whole of government issues that were raised at the beginning. And for all stakeholders to think about using compacts, as has been quite useful in the case of Somalia, for instance, to try to really push all sides to come together behind one strategy. Third, to make better use of resources. Strong advocacy on aid is needed. It is, I think, very positive that recent panels, not actually on the subject of fragility, for instance, the high-level panel on humanitarian financing, have actually called for an increase in aid to fragile situations in order to address at the root causes the issues such as conflict, which cause large humanitarian needs. And fourth, to build southern capacity and knowledge. One of the things that I think has been most exciting about the New Deal has been the G7 Plus move to do fragile to fragile exchanges and to really draw on each other's knowledge and experience. And building that, including through building more think tank capacity in countries that are members of the G7 Plus, would be important to make sure that the New Deal can be institutionalized going forward. In summary, I think this was an outstanding normative success. Very good, very strong, but in some cases mixed in national implementation, and still needs attention in terms of investment in both aid and beyond aid instruments. There is an opportunity for a new deal for the New Deal, recognizing the victory that was achieved in the SDGs and in the incorporation of the PSG parameters in the SDGs, but using that to move forward, positioning within SDG 17, expanding the actors involved, and really focusing on the how of implementation and results. Many thanks.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much, Sarah. A lot of very useful, interesting ideas, a lot of food for thought. So what I'd like to do is turn to our panelists and ask them really to give me some insights, what they think of all this. Just to remind you then some of the conclusions, essentially that, yes, the New Deal has been influential in creating, having some normative success as reflected in the SDGs. We need to build on this. At a country level, there have been challenges in terms of actually implementation. Some interesting successes where there has been government buy-in. However, we could go further. So, and also some suggestions to how the international dialogue might want to reposition itself around means of implementation, Goal 17, and also how the G7 Plus might seek to build alliances with middle-income countries and so on. So maybe I'll just open the floor. Ask, first of all, Hodan to give me your thoughts on some of the highlights of this presentation and what kind of advice you would give the dialogue in moving forward.
Right, thank you. And if I go first, it means I take the longest. All right, thanks very much, and thank you so much for the great presentation, Sarah. I think the report was very well done, and I really enjoyed reading, and it was quite comprehensive to see the findings and the conclusions of the report. Just going to the experience in Somalia, I think the New Deal structures. As the report said, it was quite successful in Somalia, especially in terms of setting up the necessary structures that was needed. And I think going back to coding, one of my favorite lines in the report that, if the New Deal didn't exist, there would have been a need to create something like that to address it. And then in Somalia, I think it was particularly timely because we took on the compact at the time that the first really new official government came into place after the transition. So I think both the government and the compact more or less have started at the same time. So really it was pretty much the only game in town in Somalia. And I think where it was very successful was in terms of creating a space for dialogue between the government and the international partners, and even including civil society. And it was also the first time that as regional administrations were being built up, that we were also able to bring in stakeholders from the region. So we have this space where we have not just government, but also civil society, donors, regional actors, all coming together and discussing around the same language of PSG's partnership principles, etc. So I think having this similarities across there, as well as having the funding windows that are there in place, and also I think this was the first time that we had such levels of transparency in aid in Somalia as well. As a result of this, we were actually able to see where aid dollars were going. So I think there was very much lots of successes in Somalia when it comes to that. I think where we really could do better, and I think where we stop, is having to be able to translate this language and this rhetoric into actual implementation on the ground. And I think there are places where we fall short, and coming from the Ministry of Finance, I think one key area for us is, what does it mean to have, government in the driving seat? And part of that is being able to use national systems. And in Somalia, I think of the $1 billion aid dollars that comes in, it's only 8% that actually uses country systems. And that's a staggering figure when you really think about it. That's 920 million that's going completely outside of government accountability structures, oversight, and so forth. So I think and I think this is something that we really need to look at. In addition to that, another thing that comes up in the PSG experience as well, is that, we found that some PSGs were completely underfunded, with justice getting, less than 2% of the aid dollars. And then looking at PSG4, where I think the number of projects that sit within PSG4 was 144 projects. And PSG4 is supposed to be, the foundational PSG economic development and building. But when you have 144 projects sitting in such a thematic area, it really makes you think that what's really being done there is very small and very fragmented. So I think these are the kind of decisions that are made really outside of the collective structures that we've put together. Because we were able to make those decisions at a high level and aggregate level, we'd probably see more of a greater distribution around the PSGs, and we won't be seeing this kind of fragmentation. And just going back to the use of country systems agenda again, and I think this is something that we really need to push more than anything else. And I say that because I think this is where you get a great multiplier effect. And I'd like to give an example of Norway and what was done. And I think that I use that example because I think it's a very good example that not only illustrates use of national systems, but really showing that governor is in the driving seat. I think at the very beginning, when the Somali government was forming, Norway had a meeting with our president and said, what can we do for you? The president said, I really would like our civil servants paid. So I mean, it just started with just that, one request. And from there, what Norway did was better than anything that we can ask for, which is, okay, we will do that, and we can use your systems, but you need to fix your PFM systems in order for us to do that. So they gave us the capacity building in order to do that, and then they put the funds through our system, so we were able to pay civil service salaries using our national systems. Now, the reason I like to use that as an example is because if Norway acted like the rest of the 920 million that was going outside of the system, they would have hired an NGO, that NGO would have been paying our civil servants, and what would have happened after a year? After a year, the NGO would have went away, and the government would have just went back to either not paying civil servant salaries or doing it in a way that wasn't transparent. And I think that's the other equation of the risk question that's constantly used as a way of not using the system. Well, what's the other side of that risk equation? Well, it's sustainability and that benefit. And I think this is an example that really resonates with the government in Somalia. And I hope this is something that you're able to take away as well, because there is another side to this. If we don't use the systems, what else are we doing? And I think we really need to be able to look at that.
So in terms of a clear recommendation for the dialogue, I mean, how would you formulate that? Would you say that this is something that we would need to devote our attention? We have, I mean, we do claim to seek to push the use of country systems. I mean, how would you, what would you say?
I think this goes back to a bit of what we were saying yesterday. I think if you look around this room and the room that we're sitting in the dialogue, we're all in agreement. In fact, we cannot be in more agreement even if we tried. So I think everyone is in agreement that this is the right thing to do. So I think what the dialogue, I think, would be most beneficial, and just going back to the SDGs, and there's probably people on this panel that know a lot more than me about that one, but I would say we stick to what we have now in terms of this New Deal structures and the compact and the partnership principles, and deliver the SDGs through those kind of contexts. I think we can't afford to bring in another new element into this. But I think where the dialogue would be very supportive, especially at the level of country level implementation, is helping us with these, being an advocate for these types of issues, for showing, you know, how we can actually achieve this at the country level and putting that added level of pressure. And I think that's a role that the dialogue can play. And again, I just want to leave you then with just a second example of something in Somalia. And this one's very small, but it really stays with me every time I drive to the airport. Now, in Somalia, the airport area is what essentially called the green zone, and it's quite large because that's where all the development partners are, UN, everybody. This is where they all are and live, and that's where we go for meetings. Now, the roads in that area are all paved. So if I'm driving there, as soon as I get out of that green zone, as soon as I leave that airport gate, exactly where the gate is, there's a very clear line. There's where the paved road stops, and here's where, and it ends right there. So as soon as I leave that airport area, the road stops being paved, and I'm driving on rough roads. So I think this is a very small example, but it really shows that, you know, we need to start prioritizing the needs of the Somali people, and just looking at this road that's paved all the way to the airport and then stops as soon as you leave that airport really goes to show you that we need to reprioritize. Thank you.
Thank you, Hodan. Does that ring any bells, Helder? How would you pick up on Hodan's story?
Well, first of all, I'm deeply honored to be on this panel among other distinguished panelists, together with other familiar faces in this room. Before I add to what Hodan was saying, allow me just to also compliment Sarah and her team for the comprehensive and a very well done report in terms of the review that has been done since Busan, when the New Deal was launched in Busan in 2011. On behalf of the G7+, I'd like to say the following. Much has been said about the prominence of G7+ as an increasing influential constituency in the world stage. This is because of the fact that there are two key words here, the country leadership and country ownership exhibited by the G7+ countries. And also because of the fact that there is a collective effort exhibited by not only the G7+, but also our INCAF colleagues from the Northern Hemisphere, our civil society organizations, our colleagues from other countries at the capital level, as well as in New York. Remember, recently in New York, why the SDG number 16 came alive because of the fact that the G7+ stood firmly together with the support of other like-minded countries. Now, in terms of the findings of the report, with the G7+, we welcome, in general, the findings. That at the policy level, there has been some slight incremental progress in terms of the behavioral change from both the G7+ countries and also the donors' headquarters. But we need to do a little bit more, especially from the donor side. When we talk about the New Deal, let's not forget that, let's not separate the New Deal only PSG. The New Deal talks about PSGs, focus and trust principles. And the trust principles are the ones that we need to work even harder. Now, in terms of the implementation at the country level, as we know from the independent review report, it reveals to us that it is a mixed implementation at the country level. It is true. You know why? Because the government keeps changing in G7+ countries. Over the past 4 years, almost 10 countries that have got their governments keep changing. And this is very hard for my colleagues, the focal points, senior focal points who are here, from Liberia, from Central African Republic, from Togo, from Somalia, and from Timor-Leste. All of us, we experienced this kind of government change at the country level. This is one of the catalytic factor that impedes the implementation of the New Deal at the country level when we want to get the political buy-in support from those political actors. But in terms of moving forward, I take notice from Sarah's recommendation that the G7+ will need to reach out to other emerging economies. We have done that at the technical level. We reach out to G20 countries in order to share experience under the so-called fragile-to-fragile cooperation, not only among the G7+ countries, but also with other countries in transition, which has been successful in their transition in path towards resilience. The last point I'd like to say also that in terms of to make better use of resources and also to build southern coordination among ourselves, we really welcome that idea. That's why next month, when the G7+ meet in Kabul at the G7+ ministerial meeting, we're going to discuss how to operationalize the SDG and also to get dialogue at the country level in terms of implementing the SDG. So my recommendation to the IDPS community is this, that let's focus more at the country level and then bring in evidence at the country level to the policy level at the dialogue so that we can discuss, and in order to help countries moving out from fragility towards resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Helder. Thank you very much, Hodan. I'd like to ask, from our civil society perspective, what you think about this review, what you think about the recommendations outlined by Sarah, and if there are additional ones that you would give to the dialogue in terms of moving forward in this new Agenda 2030 context.
Thank you very much. You know, last night I had to read it and read it and read it again, just to make sure that I got it right. And I was reading it. For me it was a bit of a nostalgia, because I remember somewhere. I remember when we were seated in November in Busan, struggling to get people to come on board and to buy into the New Deal. And I remember after the panel discussion, the minister for Somalia at that time came to me and shook my hand and say, "Now we are going to move forward. Now we are going to do something." And he was very excited. And I asked myself, okay, so 5 years down the line, if you look at this review, are we still that excited? So for me, that was the reflection. And I do not want to question the review, because that's what it is. It is a review. So if we disagree with it, that's what the review is. It's like a mirror. It tells you what you did. If you don't like what the mirror is showing you, you don't change the mirror. You change yourself. So I didn't want to focus so much. But I think there are three fundamental questions that it left me asking. The first of all is, going back to 2011, I started asking myself, is the New Deal leaning on the wrong wall? I asked myself this question because when you read the entire review, there's a lot of conversation about aid and about aid and about aid and about money. And I asked myself, is a peace-building agenda primarily about money and about aid? And so therefore, the very first thing that I kept on asking myself is, maybe it was good that the conversation began out of Busan. It was good that began out of one of the building blocks. But I think that it should have grown up and moved out of that house. And it should have been a conversation about a much more political development process, rather than what we are. So that's the very first thing that I have been asking myself. The second thing that I've been asking myself is listening to what has happened in Somalia, and it's very good to hear some of the good news that is happening out of Somalia. I ask myself, do we really need to talk about a social compact, or should we go back and talk about the fundamentals of what informs a social compact, which is a social contract? Because principally what we have in post-conflict countries is a broken relationship between those who are led and those who are leading. You can insert all the other things you want to insert, but that will be an elite bargain. You can talk about the compact until the cows come home. You can talk about all the money you need, but unless we are able to renew that contract, unless we are able to recognize that the contract is broken and we need to renew it, I am not sure how far we'll go. So I don't see a lot of that in the report. A lot of what I see is what the elites do. So there's a lot of discussion about what donors need to do, what the governments need to do, what the Minister of Finance need to do, and what the aid corporation, but I don't see us recognizing that unless we go back and renew the social contract with our own citizens, we will not go very far. So that's the second thing. And then finally, the third thing that I do notice in the report, a lot of this is tied to the first one. I have always had discussions with my own colleagues in the civil society, and I've always told them I am very cognizant of the fact that in the country where I come from, I probably come from the middle class. If you look at my tie, you look at my coat, you look at my shoes, I have to be very careful before I claim to represent citizens. Very, very careful. In post-conflict countries, it's even much more difficult to talk about civil society, because the key areas of where jobs exist is always either in government or in civil society. And so I have been asking us to go beyond our traditional definition of Europeanized civil society and begin asking ourselves, what do the citizens really want? And to a large extent, I was a bit excited when I saw in a section of the report a mention of subnational consultations, but it doesn't feature anywhere in the report about what those consultations brought out. What comes out in the report is what the NGOs said, and what the government said, and what the donors said, and what the other stakeholders says. Maybe I got it wrong, but there's never a single voice of any citizen who actually said, you went to Busan, this is what you brought us. 5 years down the line, this is where we are. I don't see that in the report, and I wish that I could have seen a little bit of more. So for me, those are some of the things that are running through my head as we look at this. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. So you would have liked to see more about citizens, more about the social contract. It's not about money. And with that, I'll hand over to Annelies. It's not about money, Annelies. What would you say? Coming from the bank.
All right, thanks for putting me on the spot. I'll speak about something else.
I was just looking for a nice lead-in.
And I've now made so many notes because, I mean, everybody at Jordan, he started asking me what's new about the New Deal. And so I'm always thinking, okay, what is new about the New Deal? And one thing I would like to challenge here is basically the finding that the New Deal has been a success in terms of providing a coalition for change. And I think we simply have to be more modest, because the New Deal has been established, but it has actually been sitting within the same community of donors, G7+, and civil society actors over the last 5 years. There have been attempts of including private sector, there have been attempts, but honestly, I think I know most of the people in this room. But when I see across the world, there are so many resilience communities, peace-building communities, whatever kind of mediation communities out there who all work on the same things as we work on. And they live happily without having heard about the New Deal. So I think the new thing is that the New Deal has to be a New Deal for more people. And that, for me, is the next step. So how is that done? I think there are two opportunities. And the first opportunity is to really change the sort of go to country level, work at country level. You know, we need to stop saying it. We need to actually do it. And the way we do that, and why we do that, is because that's the only way we can get the broader communities to work together. All those communities who've not heard about the New Deal, they are there, and we can work together in a much more sustainable way and work on prevention, work on all of these long-term building blocks that just need to come together. And that's where the financing comes in. We have such a fragmented structure of financing various bits and pieces. And I believe, and I think that Somalia is one of the starting examples, possibly, when Hudan has been there another 10 years, that this will start to come together. So I think that let us try to stop the talk and do the walk. Perhaps we shouldn't have any meetings in Washington or New York for the next year, and just next time meet in the Central African Republic, which is what we were invited to do today, this morning, by the president, who spoke very well about how the G7 Plus has helped her, how a lot of actors are there now to help. But let's go there. Let's stop just talking about this in meetings as we move forward. And that takes me to the International Dialogue for Peace Building and State Building, which I love dearly, and I'm part of it. But you know, the conversation actually finishes very fast when you say, I'm going to an IDPS meeting. And people say, what is this? I don't understand this. You have the G7 Plus, and then you have INCAF, and then you have civil society, and then you have, what's this other thing? So I think that the recommendation in the report to actually make that a much broader kind of movement should be our next step. And again, I think that needs to happen at country level. I don't believe it can happen at international level. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Annelies. So getting us back to country level, I'd like to take the opportunity perhaps to open this up to the floor. I know there are panelists who are waiting to speak, but I'd just like to get a sense of where our audience sits on this. Does anyone have any questions or comments they would like to make in relation to the presentation, or from what any panelists have said? And I'll ask the other panelists to respond to you in their interventions. Everyone feel okay? I've got one hand, two hands. Okay, I'll take 3 or 4 comments. The first person, please. If you could just introduce yourself and.
Sure, it's Andrew Albertson. My question is, we're talking mainly about development donors, and I recognize that, especially since we spoke of the importance of whole of country unified processes. Can any of you speak to any successes in engaging security assistance and cooperation? I'd just be curious.
Okay, thank you. I had another question in the corner there. Or if you, well, yeah. Maybe if you could, yeah, just ask the question, it's fine.
I retired from the World Bank recently, and I worked a lot on trust funds, many of which support the fragile states. And I found that the fiduciary issues and the dialogue between donors, the bank, and the countries became very detailed and sometimes not that helpful because of different concepts. And I was very intrigued to hear Hodan's comments about country systems, obviously a huge issue, issues of ownership and so forth. But the terminology on these things varies. You can't write that into a trust fund agreement with the World Bank because it's not that you would say recipient execution, which is the same thing. So I just think it would be helpful to be very clear when the rubber hits the road and you're trying to get funds flowing, to be very, very clear on what this country system really means in a particular context.
Thank you. Any more questions, please, sir? Yes?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Nevin Knisvis from UNICEF. I work in our Nairobi regional office and sometimes traveled to Somalia in the past. Although lately I'm not actually allowed to travel because of security issues, some of which I'm sure you know of. But I guess my question is, the presentation from Sarah painted what seemed like an incredibly rosy picture of progress with the New Deal. But in countries like Somalia, we have essentially what is still a civil war. We've had bombings just this last weekend. We had a number of KDF forces killed at the beginning of the year, not including those from Burundi and Uganda last year, middle of the year and so on. Burundi is going rapidly downhill. We have, over 100,000 refugees. So I'm wondering, right, and of course in Somalia there's a discussion around imposing this national system on a number of subnational systems that creates conflict itself. How do you balance these issues? And I suppose it goes to this question from one of the speakers about the social contract and whether or not the approach of the New Deal is touching on all of the right issues, irrespective of all the tremendous progress that's already been made.
Thank you. So I'll just turn those questions to those who haven't spoken yet, and then ask maybe the others to come in. So there are 3 questions there. One, on security, how the New Deal claims to be this holistic approach, security, justice. So what is the traction? What is the experience of engaging with security actors? One. Secondly, on the issue of use of country systems, we have to define this much more clearly. What do we actually mean when we say this? This was directed particularly after your intervention, Hudan. And then thirdly, this is a rosy picture. Really, in Somalia and in Burundi and elsewhere, what we're seeing is an aggravation of conflict. The New Deal is not really doing anything to address that. How would you respond to that? Maybe I'll turn to you directly, Oscar. Do you have? You can also make your intervention, but just kind of try and think about these questions. Please.
Yes. No, thank you very much. And again, also a big pleasure to be here with the practitioners and everybody so much involved in trying to translate all these issues of principles and policies into traction, concrete action on the ground. And maybe just let me start by saying that I think what the contribution has been to actually bring back this notion of how political peace building is. That if we use instruments in a technocratic manner, we do lose our ways. And I think the report actually makes some very hard-hitting evaluations and experiences of how in certain countries this became such a formalistic, such a technocratic, such a bureaucratic approach that we lost sight of what we were trying to do, which is precisely what Paul was saying, that this is all about building legitimacy, supporting the trust, the social contract between governments who are coming in behind the aftermath of a conflict, and so how we use the instruments, and here maybe linked up to how this actually translates in practice, is the very notion also that the financial instruments that we have up to recently have been quite rigid and very unflexible, very risk-adverse, and very unsupportive of country systems and mechanisms. The Peace Building Fund, actually I'm thankful to Dan to be here because I think he was very much pushing for this Peace Building Fund to be that instrument that allows us to be very political. And political means what here? Because I think something that is extremely important not to lose sight of is that to be able to do peace building, to do state building, we do need to address root causes of conflict. And this is where all these fragility assessment, the one vision, one plan, the supporting of a compact becomes extremely important. If we do these fragility assessments through a very technocratic way of just focusing on how institutions work or not, without focusing on the politics, who's included, who's excluded, whose voices are we taking into account? Are women and youth involved in these discussions? Are the local communities participating? This whole construct can just become a discussion between government and donors. And that's clearly a very important part of a discussion if we're looking into aid effectiveness issues and how to be constructive. But this has to be fundamentally a political discussion between authorities and citizens. And the trust and legitimacy issues goes to the very heart about what is it that we end up financing and supporting. So we know, and this is, I think, the big contribution of the New Deal and the state building and peace building goals, is that we know for a fact, consistently and across the board, that not sufficient funding is coming to this notion of inclusive politics, to the notion of security and justice. I mean, the numbers that Sarah just gave actually indicate a decrease of funding into these three fundamental, constructs, if you will, of the state-citizen relationship. And the reason this is important is that the underinvestment and the non-inclusion of these factors in our programming, in our financing, actually explains a lot of the relapses that we see from back into conflict. The other thing I would like to say here in terms of how we use the fiduciary issues, because again, this is all about how we do risk management, or what type of risk and how do we address and how do we mitigate it. And I mean, to Huda's question, I mean, this is a very important part of creating legitimacy for government. You cannot have in Somalia, after 15, 20 years of basically humanitarian response through an NGO mechanism, which important as it is to save lives. If you want to put the country back together again, there needs to be a mix of implementation mechanisms that actually speak to the notion of delivering services in a democratic, inclusive manner, but also asserting the authority. At some point, we do need to get an economy going back here. We do need to raise domestic revenues, and these countries do need to be able to stand on their feet so that we're not constantly talking about ODA and dependency and this donor-government relationship. But it goes to the heart of how we assess and manage risk. And much has been said about why many donors do not use national systems. Certainly, if the capacities, if the abilities of the institutions absorbing and delivering this aid are not set in place, they will never be used. And so in the case of Somalia, I'm just actually happy to announce last week that the Peace Building Fund is actually putting fund through the national window of the SDRF, which again, a very complicated construct among different donors, the African Development Bank, the World Bank, the EU, the UN. And here is test casing, stress testing, if you will, the use of national systems to demonstrate and to open up avenues that would allow actually to establish these linkages between central governments and local authorities. In terms of something that I think is extremely important is that this notion of a common strategy is absolutely fundamental. Otherwise, you have dispersed work going in places where we need this focus. And here, several things. I think the importance of that common one vision, one plan, so to bring coherence into the international donors assistance framework to a country, extremely important. But that has to build on a political exercise of consultations, of national and local dialogues. It has to be about how we build on political agreements. This cannot be a top-down imposition, because we've seen what's happened in some places. I think the 2 or 3 cases given in the study extremely important. And hopefully this new deal is about that sustained international attention. We do know for a fact, as the DSG was saying today, that once we leave, once the peacekeeping operations move on, the special political missions move on, that there is this financial cliff. There's the cliff on inattention. There's the cliff that affects many of the orphan aid countries that are still an issue. The aid might have increased, but not necessarily to the aid orphans. And again, this platform of dialogue has to become, and I think the recommendations of getting the G7+ to engage with a much broader membership of member states. It's very telling, and we were discussing them yesterday, that even the notion and the term of fragility in New York, where you have the Security Council and the General Assembly, member states are pretty much allergic to this whole concept. I mean, it has a whole political significance. And we need to deconstruct. And this, how can I say, this engagement between the G7+ and their wider membership needs to be built on a political platform. It needs to involve regional players as well. This regional dimension of conflicts needs to become part of what the New Deal is actually focusing on. And last but not least, I think the New Deal, the new part of the New Deal has to be about how we harmonize now the state-building, peace-building goals with the SDGs, because this is the agenda out there. This is what member states are being asked to put in place, to report against. And again, how we do this through flexible financing instruments, I think is the key issue. How the Peace Building Fund, how the different instruments within the UN work in synchronicity with the World Bank, the Peace Building, State Building Fund, the EU Stability Fund, etc., that there needs to be, if you will, a harmonization of instruments going in and addressing, again, the drivers of conflict. Prevention has to become a very important word going into the humanitarian summit, because we know that we are in an absolutely unsustainable path of responding to humanitarian need and peacekeeping operations. And unless we do development better, unless we do peace building, unless we do conflict prevention systematically, and we have, how can I say, predictable manners of doing this, mechanisms, we will keep seeing a price tag that will be absolutely unsustainable going down.
Right.
So.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Many reflections there. So prevention being our watchword. Perhaps we'll send that back to Nancy Lindborg from USIP, who asked us for a word that we could use to capture what we were actually talking about when we talk about Goal 16. I'd like to bring you in, Chukwuemeka, and ask you, give in the light of your experience of your involvement in the Ebola recovery in Sierra Leone, you know, how, and also your engagement with the private sector, how you see this, how you see the New Deal moving forward, what kind of New Deal for the New Deal?
Thank you. The longer this went on, the more alarmed I was becoming, because a lot of excellent ideas and really so many ideas. But let me just start where you touched on there. The Ebola response in Sierra Leone. And I think it was a very clear example, the model that Sarah gave of the New Deal, very much located within the Ministry of Finance. It's very much owned there. I don't think it's been able to sort of reach out beyond. And so the Ebola response, Ebola 2014, the national and international response was limited, and it was clear that the Ministry of Health, which had responsibility, wasn't able to handle it, and therefore there was, from many different directions and angles, the decision to create a specific response mechanism called the National Ebola Response Center. That became the vehicle through which it was possible to channel both the national effort but also the international effort, and eventually to end the outbreak. Now, what we didn't do, we knew that the NERC was a temporary structure, and we knew that it would come to the point where we would close it down. We also knew that the Ministry of Health was completely dysfunctional. And at that point, we did nothing to actually address those underlying issues. So come the end of the outbreak, we go back and hand things back to the ministry. So it was a missed opportunity, and I think that this speaks to some of the challenges that Sarah mentioned, where there's a disconnect between the language and the principles and what we hear in Paris and places, and what actually happens on the ground in the countries. And bridging that, I think, is really important. And because some of the most influential donors, which on the one hand have signed up to the New Deal and everything, but it seems as if there are different actors who have responsibility for sort of humanitarian responses and so on. So that was a very, very big, and I feel, because I was the lead on transition, and so I actually feel that sense of failure very much in that regard. That opportunity, we had an ongoing dialogue with the president. We should have, I think, brought to his attention the need and to look very creatively, because, you know, in the middle of an outbreak is not the time to start reshuffling governments and so on, but we should have thought through some very creative interventions, anticipating. It was not hard to see that the train wreck, you know, that was coming along. So I think that's a very clear example, an acute example. But I also want to just touch on, in relation to the Ebola response, something that I feel that when I look at the literature around fragility and resilience, it's almost as if we have a spectrum. You know, on one hand, there's fragility, on the other hand, there's resilience. But I think actually, in Sierra Leone's case, there was resilience within the fragile context. A lot of the responses, the early responses, coming from communities, very much to you know, Paul's point about not the usual suspects in the NGO community or in donor communities, ordinary communities, ordinary people, grassroots level, responding. Leaders, elites within the society also forming coalitions to respond at the community level. So there is, it seems to me, even within quite fragile context, a lot of resilience that we're not tapping into. And we very quickly get into this sort of narrative, especially as we did with the Ebola response, and it looks very much like solely an international response, and yet the heavy lifting was done by many of the nationals, and we haven't strengthened and built on that resilience, and I think this is a sort of missing point. I very much also endorse the idea of the social contract and how to enrich that. So in terms of the private sector, because what we tried to do, I just felt very strongly in Sierra Leone that with the response and the intensive use of information communications technology, right there in the heart of that crisis was an opportunity, and it was a silver lining, because ICT clearly is an important tool for development generally. So what we tried to do with Dialogue, in partnership with the Dialogue, was organize a workshop, mainly with ICT players, but also with Ebola survivors, just to see what sorts of opportunities there were, what sort of entrepreneurship and evidence that there was there. And I think we found quite a bit of that. Now, the challenges, and looking at the recommendations from the report, strengthening operational effectiveness and political relevance, I think, and also the second one I'd also touch on is the strengthening the organizational impact of the dialogue. And I think there's huge opportunities to really move this very much in the direction that fellow panelists have mentioned. Because clearly we have to go beyond workshops. I mean, it's good, I think, that what we did was to engage with national actors on the ground. And they weren't the usual suspects in the dialogue process for the most part. And issues did come up. I'll just give one example. There's almost a civil war between the elements of the private sector and the Ministry of Information and Communication in Sierra Leone at the moment, to do with a lot of issues around fiber and, so quite intense policy issues, but you step back and you recognize these as quite central issues around political economy, state issues, predation, and so on, that need to be addressed. And so this was an opportunity in the context of looking at this to see how to facilitate, and I think this is one of the key things that the dialogue can do, is to convene and help to convene these sorts of dialogues. In contexts where these are not people who talk about fragility and resilience and New Deal, but the issues that they're dealing with are absolutely the same issues in terms of the fragility that are the core concerns. So I think the message has to be to drive down, to drill down into the details. And for that, you need to be there. And of course, that doesn't mean building up a whole presence. I think it means working with the partners that you already work with, but bringing your own distinct lens of fragility into those conversations so that you're part of those conversations with partners that you work with, but you're able to really contribute. Because if I look at, from the private sector point of view, what does success look like? In countries that are very fragile, in an economy that is still quite uncertain, it is about investment. And it's about, as Kathleen has mentioned, increasing investment in these fragile contexts, which is not easy to do. You've got reputational risks, you've got all the kind of challenging issues that exist. How do you sequence, as you raised, how do you sequence all of these capacity building issues and so on? And how do you take measured risk? And I think all of this, investors who are at least minded to do so need more support and more help. So I think this is where you really need to get, in my view, very, very practical, very concrete, to take this down to a level. And there are lots of ideas in terms of specific angles that one can take. If you take one particular country, and I can give you more thoughts on practically how that can work. But I think, you have these three pillars: the public-private dialogue. And again, I mean, that's really important because it's the lack of trust. It's the perceptions, it's all the things that go on day to day, and people are struggling to run a business and dealing with all these issues, and finding the people in government who want to move things forward, but facilitating that public-private dialogue. And that's happening, but much more needed. And with the expertise that you have within that context, I think it's really important. A second point that you have, and again, a strength, is mapping what is known about business ecosystems. When I think about Sierra Leone and I think about the Ebola crisis and everything else, they're just symptomatic of these deeper underlying issues. And so much of international development, it seems to me, is so projectized that we're not able to deal with systems challenges, systemic issues. And yet that's the fundamental. And I'm just struck by, we don't have the tools, we don't have the language to even present people to understand the interlinkages between the issues. And this is where I think this understanding of these systemic challenges is really, really important and a real contribution to the discussion. So again, very, very, very practical. And then your third point about strategic communications and what can be done where and what should be done, again, is critical. Because it's really about how we bring together the entire community that can make a difference. And we're too fragmented. There are just too many meetings, too many bodies, too many jargon, and all the rest of it. So again, trying to sort of synthesize this and drill down. And I think if you can do that maybe in this New Deal for the New Deal context, a number of countries where perhaps there's some eyes and ears already present, and translate this into something very tangible, because that's where the legitimacy will come in. This is where it begins to mean something to communities. Because I must say, and you know this, Catherine, that the perception, and I don't think it's an unfair one, is that when you talk about the New Deal and all this sort of thing, there's this, and people on the ground, that's well and good, and you'll sort of sign up to what they say, but we don't see it happening on the ground here. And I think it's a criticism, but it's not a sort of dismissal. It's an opportunity to actually, is that last mile? And I think that's the phase that you're in now. I think you've established the principles, the norms and everything. Now, how do we get to that last mile? And I think that's where, and that's how, if you're going to get the private sector involved, that's key, because you'll come to one meeting, two meetings, third meeting, they're sending somebody very junior because they don't see, where's the beef. So I think that's the opportunity that there is.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Chukwuemeka. So, patiently waiting, Dan, how would you take us, how would you advise us to get to that last mile?
Stepping back for a second, I think that we should begin by understanding that fragile states are under a degree of pressure that is building and is only going to build across the next 10, 20, 30 years. They're under pressure because of the situation which they're in now. They're under further pressure because of climate change. They're under pressure because of increasing competition for natural resources. They're under pressure because the world is steadily becoming a more unequal place. And unless these big issues are addressed, and even if they are addressed, there are sort of, as with climate change, there are pressures stacked up in both the natural ecosystem, but also, if I can use the expression, the political and economic ecosystems, which are still going to play themselves out, however good and progressive the reforms are at an international level. So the best climate change, or the best implementation imaginable of the Paris Agreement on climate change is not going to protect fragile states from the consequences of climate change for the next 20 to 30 years. So the conclusion from that is that the coalition around the New Deal needs to be stronger. And there are two senses in which it can be stronger, and I think that implicitly we've been discussing both of them so far. One is that it is stronger in the sense of more effective, and this is the on the ground, the how, and the so on discussion. And the second is that it is stronger in the sense of being bigger, which is the issue that Annalisa raised, of, is it at the moment in too much in the narrow circles? And I think that the question that's asked, well, how do you make it bigger then, is a crucial one. So today, in thinking about that, we're looking at norms. And so one part of understanding how to make the coalition stronger, how to motivate and mobilize for more efficient, for more effective, impactful implementation, is to have clarity on the norms. It is to understand what is there in the peace and state building goals, what those values are which are expressed there. And I want to just focus on three particularly right now that come out of the discussion that we've been having so far. And the first one is to do with ownership. For a while, I've been semi-allergic to the expression national ownership, because it's been translated into being a donor tick box category, which actually means an agreement between a representative of a donor agency or government and some essentially unaccountable person representing the recipient state, and they can sign up to something, and now you've got ownership, and that's fine. And then you find that the aid is being delivered and implemented in exactly the same old way. But ownership which goes beyond that national elite level, ownership where you have a development, either a project or better development program or strategy, which is owned by a much broader section of the community, expressing themselves in part through civil society organizations, but also perhaps through political parties, and also through their own kind of direct representation in communities. That inclusive version of ownership, I think it is crucial. And I think that it was core in the beginning of the idea of the international dialogue and leading to the New Deal, was that something was meant to be happening here where the donors recognized that if it was visibly the donor governments driving this agenda of change, it was going to get bogged down. So they were trying to perform a quite careful strategic and political operation to be supporting an agenda of change which they were not driving as hard as they could, in order to help there be the space for other actors, and especially as it became the G7+, to come in and to be driving that. And I think we have reached the moment where the donors need to pull back even further. And the ownership by the G7+ and others who can join that coalition has to be yet sort of more comprehensive. For that to happen, I think, the second, alongside of ownership, the second norm to be thinking about is accountable authority. That seems to me to be a way to express the core of many of the things that we say about good governance or democracy or whatever it is. It's not a rejection of authority at all, but authority must be accountable. And if you have that accountable authority, expressing that broader sense of ownership, then I think you can get the third one to come in, which is a concept that we haven't talked about before, but I think motivates almost everybody in this room, and that is solidarity. Right? And that is an understanding that, in an expression which has been absolutely laid waste and trashed by the Conservative government in the UK. So anybody who's British here, I apologize for using it, but we are all in this together. We are all facing climate change. We are all facing increased inequality worldwide. We are all facing the dangers and the risks. And that solidarity, I think, also has to be a driving force of it. Now, all of this, to my mind, simply underlines points that everybody else has made quite clearly. So I will just remind you of them and then stop. Right? And that is, this cannot be a technical or technocratic exercise. This is an exercise that is about politics, and that makes everybody who is engaged in it into a political actor. You then have to negotiate that politics with each other. What can we agree on? I think also, going back to the original evolution of the international dialogue idea and leading towards the New Deal, it was a really important strategic decision which was taken. Right? At a meeting, you know, and this is so top down, I blush to think about it now. But the decision was, let's not go for unanimity around the principles in the New Deal. Let's not. Let's get on board those who can. Let's invite those who support these ideas, this idea of an agreement between donors and recipients that takes a new form and engages in the issues in a new way. Let's invite those people, those states, those governments, those civil society organizations who can agree to this, to get involved, to get active, because that is the way that you can get forward momentum. I think that was the right strategic decision then. I think that the right strategic decision now is to broaden that out again. Still not probably unanimous. Not everybody agrees with what is involved in the New Deal. Mm-hmm. But yes, now I think that strengthening the coalition means stronger and deeper in terms of more effective, and also broader in the sense of more actors, more players.
Thank you very much, Dan. Now, we are at 1 o'clock. I don't want to abuse our gracious host, so I'm not going to be able to open it out. I know there must be questions, comments, but I think I'm just left to thank our panelists and thank you for being here to make this such an exciting, very interesting, and a wonderful opportunity to discuss the future of the New Deal and the future of the dialogue. So I'm just going to ask you to put your hands together and applaud our panelists. Thank you. Mr.
Yes, that's right. Fantastic. I'll be back in touch with everyone because I want us to try and exploit this wonderful